The head of MI5, the UK's domestic security service, recently addressed a critical press briefing about the foreign threats facing the UK, especially those originating from outside its borders but targeting British soil. To give you a brief introduction, the intelligence landscape in the UK is typically divided between MI5, responsible for domestic security, and MI6, which oversees foreign intelligence. Of course, there are other entities such as GCHQ that handle specific areas like cyber intelligence, but for simplicity's sake, MI5 deals primarily with internal threats, while MI6 manages external threats. In this context, the recent statements from the head of MI5, Ken McCallum, shine a light on the foreign threats the UK is facing, with a particular focus on the activities of Russia, China, and Iran. These nations, according to McCallum, are involved in everything from espionage to sabotage on British soil, and their influence is being felt across Europe. At the core of McCallum's concerns is Russia's ongoing efforts to undermine the UK. According to McCallum, Russian intelligence agents are actively trying to destabilize British streets, aiming to create chaos. These actions range from sabotage and arson to other clandestine operations designed to weaken the UK's infrastructure. McCallum explicitly stated that the UK's military and political support for Ukraine has been a significant driving factor behind Russia's hostile activities. The backdrop of this conflict creates a volatile environment where intelligence services are pushed to their limits. McCallum's revelation included a critical statistic. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, MI5 has expelled over 750 suspected Russian agents from the UK in the past 2.5 years. These individuals, if left unchecked, would have orchestrated numerous attacks across Britain. It's a reminder of the constant threat posed by foreign espionage. Russia's tactics, however, have evolved. Rather than deploying its own agents for operations, Russia increasingly relies on local intermediaries and criminals to carry out its objectives. These local actors, often unaware of who they are working for, might commit acts of arson or sabotage without realizing they are pawns in a much larger geopolitical game. One striking example McCallum gave was the case of a weapons depot in London. Suppose Russia wanted to destroy a facility storing military supplies destined for Ukraine. Instead of sending Russian agents, they might employ local criminals with long rap sheets to carry out the attack. These individuals, motivated by money, would have no idea that the ultimate mastermind behind the operation was the Russian state. As a result, tracing these actions back to Moscow becomes nearly impossible. In fact, MI5 has observed a significant increase in crimes against the British state orchestrated by foreign powers. In the past year alone, such incidents have risen by 48%. Russia is not the only nation implicated in this rise. China and Iran also play prominent roles. Alongside Russia, Iran has emerged as a major concern for MI5. According to McCallum, Iranian agents have been involved in at least 20 serious plots to harm British citizens, most of whom are dissidents or critics of the Iranian regime. Iran's actions appear to be part of a broader strategy to suppress opposition voices abroad, extending Tehran's reach well beyond its borders. A significant example of Iran's activities came to light last December when the offices of Iran International, a Farsi-language opposition media outlet, were targeted in the UK. Iranian operatives sought to intimidate and pressure the outlet, which has been critical of the Iranian government. While some arrests were made in connection with this case, it highlights the extent of Iran's efforts to silence dissent. McCallum warned that the situation could escalate even further if tensions between Israel and Iran rise. If Israel were to launch a direct attack on Iranian facilities, it is likely that Iran would increase its activities in the UK, potentially leading to more aggressive actions against Iranian dissidents living on British soil. McCallum's concerns reflect the delicate balance of Middle Eastern geopolitics, which has a direct impact on domestic security in the UK. The conflicts in the Middle East, especially the ongoing tension between Israel and Iran, are deeply intertwined with the UK's internal security, influencing everything from public protests to foreign espionage. While Russia and Iran operate in the shadows, McCallum also emphasized the growing threat posed by China. Unlike Russia, which engages in more overt acts of sabotage, China's approach is more subtle but no less dangerous. The Chinese government has been actively working to exert influence over Chinese citizens living abroad, including in the UK. These efforts include harassment and intimidation of Chinese dissidents and activists. In a particularly disturbing revelation, McCallum discussed the discovery of secret police stations that China has set up in various countries, including the US and Canada. These stations, which are controlled by the Chinese state but operate without the knowledge of local authorities, serve as hubs for monitoring Chinese citizens and coercing them into cooperating with Beijing. In some cases, these stations have been used to pressure individuals into gathering intelligence or engaging in other illegal activities on behalf of the Chinese government. In the UK, China has employed similar tactics, targeting Chinese nationals who have been critical of the Communist Party. These dissidents face harassment and threats, and in some cases, Chinese operatives attempt to force them into spying for China. Beyond this, McCallum noted that Chinese intelligence services are also focused on stealing sensitive information from British institutions. Cyber attacks originating from China have targeted government departments, universities, and private companies, all with the aim of gaining access to valuable intellectual property. China's actions pose a unique threat to the UK. While Russia and Iran are more focused on direct attacks and sabotage, China's efforts are aimed at subverting the UK's institutions and influencing its society from within. This makes it a more insidious and long-term threat. In response to these activities, MI5 has been closely monitoring Chinese operations in the UK and working to safeguard critical infrastructure and sensitive information. Perhaps the most surprising revelation from McCallum's briefing was his assertion that the greatest long-term threat facing the UK is not from Russia, Iran, or China, but from Islamist extremism. According to McCallum, 75% of MI5's counterterrorism efforts are focused on combating Islamist terrorism, with the remaining 25% dedicated to far-right terrorism. While the Islamic State, ISIS, has lost much of its former power, it remains a persistent threat. McCallum noted that ISIS and similar groups have shifted tactics in recent years. Instead of establishing formal cells, they now rely heavily on the internet to radicalize young people, many of whom are disillusioned or disconnected from society. These new recruits are often teenagers between the ages of 13 and 18, making them highly vulnerable to online radicalization. This trend is deeply concerning because it creates a new breed of terrorists who are not motivated by ideology or a deep sense of belief but by the thrill of violence or the lure of money. In some cases, these young individuals are radicalized in their bedrooms and given simple instructions to carry out attacks. The ease with which they can be manipulated makes them highly unpredictable and dangerous. They may not even understand the broader goals of the terrorist organizations they are working for. The growing threat of online radicalization is particularly difficult for security services to counter. McCallum described a scenario in which a terrorist group might reach out to a random individual online and convince them to carry out an attack in exchange for money. These individuals may have no prior connection to the group and no clear ideological motivation, making them nearly impossible to track. This new generation of terrorists operates more like lone wolves, disconnected from traditional terrorist networks and therefore much harder to predict or prevent. McCallum's remarks also touched on the rise of far-right extremism, which has become an increasingly visible threat in the UK. While Islamist extremism remains the top priority for MI5, far-right extremism is responsible for a significant portion of terrorist plots in recent years. In fact, some of the most violent attacks in the UK in the past decade have been carried out by individuals with links to far-right groups. One of the most alarming developments in recent months was a surge in far-right attacks against Muslims in the UK. In one particularly shocking incident, far-right extremists attempted to set fire to several mosques and attacked individuals they believed to be Muslim. These attacks have contributed to a growing sense of fear and division within the UK's Muslim communities. The far-right's rise in the UK mirrors similar trends across Europe. In countries like Germany and France, far-right groups have gained significant political influence, and their violent rhetoric has inspired a wave of attacks against minority groups. McCallum's warning about the growing threat of far-right extremism is a reminder that terrorism comes in many forms and that the UK must remain vigilant against all forms of extremism. While MI5's primary focus is on protecting the UK from internal threats, McCallum's briefing also highlighted the global nature of terrorism today. Islamist extremism, in particular, is not confined to any one country. Groups like ISIS continue to carry out attacks across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and their influence extends far beyond the regions where they are based. In recent months, there have been several high-profile ISIS attacks in countries like Germany and France, as well as ongoing violence in the Middle East. These attacks serve as a reminder that the threat of terrorism is far from over and that groups like ISIS remain committed to their goal of spreading violence and fear around the world. McCallum's comments about the global nature of terrorism also underscore the importance of international cooperation in combating these threats. The UK cannot tackle these challenges alone. It must work closely with its allies in Europe, the United States, and beyond to share intelligence, coordinate counter-terrorism efforts, and disrupt terrorist networks before they can carry out attacks. In conclusion, MI5's latest assessment paints a complex and worrying picture of the threats facing the UK. From Russian espionage and sabotage to China's covert influence operations and Iran's targeting of dissidents, the UK is facing an array of challenges from hostile foreign actors. But perhaps the most significant threat is the rise of online radicalization, particularly among young people, which is transforming the nature of terrorism in the 21st century. As McCallum noted, the UK must remain vigilant in the face of these evolving threats. The security services are working tirelessly to protect the country from harm, but they cannot do it alone. Public awareness and cooperation will be critical in the fight against terrorism, espionage, and foreign interference. The road ahead is uncertain, but with a clear understanding of the challenges it faces, the UK can continue to defend itself against those who seek to do it harm. Thanks for watching.